Good morning, my fellow HASP scholars. Welcome to July's monthly meeting. We've got a good one for you today, and I'm not biased at all. There's a few things we want to do. Let's start with these evil devices. We all have one. Please put yours on silent. Let's dispense with my quote of the month. Last time, when I subbed for Sharon, I quoted a great American philosopher known as Yogi Berra. This time I'm going to quote John Wooden, for those of you who don't know who John Wooden is, 8-time national champion basketball coach at UCLA. And John Wooden said, "Don't let what you cannot do interfere with what you can do." I love that one. Before we go any further, Doug Walford will introduce our new members and our guests.
I've said this before, but there's no doubt that I have the best job in this organization. What a great day. We're really pleased to have 11 guests with us this morning, and I'd like to welcome each of you by name, so I'll read off those names. So, attending today, Harvey Burkauer, Barbara Suker, Steve Suker, Al Bradfield, Hank A., Norm Van Salkema, Jan Veenstra, Sue Sauer, Will Amon, Caroline Van Glan, and John Jones. We are so happy you're with us today. We hope you enjoy today's program. We hope you get to know all that HASP offers you soon, and we'd love to have you join us. Then, very pleased to welcome and introduce 18 new members. How's that? And these are folks who have joined since June 1st. And I'll ask you to stand when I read your name and turn and face your fellow HASP members so that we can appropriately recognize and greet you. Some of our new members are attending online, so we won't be able to see them here today, obviously. But joining HASP today, John Ticey, Bill Evenson, Mark Ryder, Nancy Ryder, Fred Bassett, Tom Rixey Sr., Judy Bell, Barbara Witt, Dwight Hillstrom, John Mulder, Mary Mulder, Bill Overman, Lee Overman, Steve Nordstrom, Jean Nordstrom, Sue Volkers, Richard Frost, and Susie Frost. We are so happy to welcome you to HASP. Thank you. One side note, we think the guest table was really busy this morning. One of you may have gotten by us without signing in per usual. I won't ask you to stand up and identify yourself, but find me or Amy or Ian afterwards so that we can get you properly registered. We'd love to do that. So, great to have you here. As I always say, if you know somebody who you are sure would love HASP, what HASP has to offer them, talk to them about it and bring them as a guest to one of the monthly meetings. So, thank you.
Thank you, Doug. couple more announcements. Tomorrow, you'll get an email so you can begin your renewal for the 23-24 membership of HASP. So click on the link and you can take care of that tomorrow. A week from today, everybody is invited to the Summer Sizzle, which is hosted by our Special Events Committee. This is going to be from 5 to 8 o'clock, July 18th, at the Outdoor Discovery Center, which is out on Grasskip Road. You will get a map, you'll get a HASP happenings with a map, and you can RSVP, you should RSVP for this, RSVP. Just click the link and do that. Bring an hors d'oeuvre or a dessert, and come and have fun. We are a community, and this is a community event. Our August meeting will be by the directors of the Herrick Library, and they will talk about the challenges that libraries today are facing, such as book banning, things like that, and fiduciary problems. So it'll be very interesting. Please come to that. Now, I'll put this thing away. Now I get the fun part. I get to introduce our speaker, my daughter, Dr. Shannon Kobs Nawotniak. For those of you who don't know her, she was born here in Holland, Holland Hospital, went to West Ottawa High School, graduated from Michigan Tech in geosciences, and got her PhD from SUNY Buffalo, did a year of fellowship at the University of Mexico in Mexico City, and then joined the faculty at Idaho State University, where she is now a full professor. She is the current director of the Honors College, and she will assume the chair of geology in about a year. She does a lot of research in volcanology, that's her specialty, and does research for NASA, which you're going to see some of today. And she's involved with the Artemis project, the Mars project, Enceladus, is that right? Enceladus, which is an icy moon around Saturn, and all these other really very cool and interesting places. She began her lecturing when she was a second grader. Could you run the video, please? She doesn't know this is coming.
This is petrified wood. Millions and millions and millions of years ago, this was a tree log. And rock got into it, and it had to be somewhere where there isn't water, like a desert or someplace. And rock got into it, and it made it hard like rock. And now it's nothing like wood anymore. It's as hard as rock.
Gotcha. By the time she graduated, she had given similar talks to that all the way through her senior year in high school to kindergartners and second graders. All the kids in West Ottawa came to call her the Rock Lady. But it all began here in Holland. As a matter of fact, one of her original teachers, Miss Carla, is sitting right there, her preschool teacher. So you didn't come here to listen to me, you came here to listen to Shannon. So please welcome her.
I was not warned about that video. You'll note I'm slightly taller, don't have the brownie uniform anymore. I apologize. Clearly, it would be better if I was still that, but that's all right. It is my pleasure to get to be here with you today and talking about some of the stuff that's going on as we prepare to return to the moon. So I'm guessing all of you remember the magic of the Apollo era. The idea of actually putting a person on the moon, which seemed so absolutely impossible and absurd and became a reality as part of the space race. And it's been a hot minute. So we are actually at the cusp of a resurgence of the space program, of being able to actually go and land on these places again. So if we look back at Apollo, our first landing on the moon, Apollo 11 was the first people on the moon. This is 1969. We have Apollo 12, same year. But the entire Apollo series ends in 1972. That's not very much time at all. For all that we accomplished, for the fundamental science, the excitement, the innovation, the changes that impacted all of the rest of our economy. And I'm not just talking about Tang and Velcro. I mean, those are popular ones. But this literally transformed so much of what we had and could do. But it was actually a fairly short amount of time that we actually spent there. And a lot of people don't realize this, but in 1972, Jack Schmitt, on the very last Apollo mission to go to the moon, was the first scientist that went. We have had exactly one scientist set foot on the moon. Which is nothing, not to say anything negative about the rest of the amazing astronauts and heroes that went up, but it adds this challenge, especially with the technology that we had at that time for communicating back and forth. We are there to do science, but we don't have scientists. We don't have a good way to communicate to them, to be able to enable them with the people on Earth, helping them, coaching them, making suggestions, seeing through their eyes and seeing stuff. It's going to limit some of what we can do. So one of the very exciting things about what we're going to be doing now is getting those people back up there. Now, we haven't stopped with humans in space. We've had human spaceflight the entire time since Apollo. You know, we had Skylab, we had the Space Shuttle program, we've obviously had International Space Station, which is continuing. And while we've had scientists up there, most of what they're actually doing is either controlled experiments, say in limited gravity or zero gravity, or it's engineering problems. And so when they're doing tasks, a lot of it is extraordinarily scripted. NASA does not believe in errors. They do not believe in things that could go wrong. Occasionally, things have gone catastrophically wrong. There is no tolerance for that. If you walk around, Johnson Space Center, every place you go, you will see the signs that make it clear every decision that you make as a member of that organization is potentially life or death for somebody else. There is no margin. Error is not accepted. So what do we do to be able to enable science and exploration, which oftentimes is based off of this evolving situation of, oh, I just found this thing, what do I do now? It's dynamic as you learn more things, coupling that to the situation of, for safety reasons, every last step must be scripted. Right now, if they're going to do a repair on the International Space Station, they will literally spend time in virtual reality practicing everything that they're going to do. You see a picture of the wrench that you're going to use. It looks identical to the one you're going to have. You literally will go through it. You'll have to repeat back the steps. It is very, very controlled. But that doesn't work well when we're talking about putting people back on the moon and having them actually conduct what is new and original scientific exploration. A famous example of this human factor is seatbelt rock. And this happened during Apollo 15 when the astronauts had the lunar rover and they're driving around and they see a rock that's different. And our astronauts have gone through enough training that they know something that is different is something that is important. But they know, for safety reasons, they are not going to be allowed to stop and collect this rock. So, being proper astronauts, they lied. Now, astronauts are always about this far away from a minor mutiny anyway. You can imagine with that sort of crafting of all of your time and making sure you know what a wrench is, that can be a little grating. And when you're being told what to do from somebody so far away, that can also be a very difficult situation. You're like, yes, I do know how to walk. I got this. So, David Scott and his teammate knew that the only way they could collect this rock was if they were talking about a safety issue. So rather than say, hey, we got a cool rock, permission to stop, my seatbelt doesn't work. I just can't quite get this buckled. We have to call an emergency stop. Now, back with Apollo 15, we don't have live-time video coming down. We have the audio transmission. Mission control can see nothing. So David and his partner up there do this audio play of well, maybe we try this. Have you tried jiggling it? Fixing this seatbelt, as he literally gets out of the rover, walks over, does the dance, because you can't actually just casually pick up a rock off the ground in a spacesuit, very limited mobility, does this thing, uses the grabber, gets the sample, puts it sort of in a bag, tucks it in the floorboards of the rover, gets back in, and now his seatbelt works just fine. Now, on one side, sure, it's just sort of like, ha-ha, like you get astronauts, you don't give them enough breathing space to make their own decisions. They're getting a little twitchy, and they're going to start faking seatbelt problems. But the point is that design didn't enable the astronauts to be able to do the science, to be able to see the thing, to be able to respond to it because it was so crafted. And we need to find this balance as we go back to Apollo, because we're moving away from an era where our astronauts are dominated by, say, like test pilots. And most of them now are scientists, engineers, medical doctors, obviously pilots as well. You're not going to skip them. But we're having a lot more of that because we're being driven not just by the technological aspect of could we get there and could we come back, but what is the science that we're doing? And so we have to find a way to find some leeway, to find some flexibility within that space. And so that's been one of the big efforts that's going on, is figuring out, as we return to the moon, what is this really going to look like? How do we do the good science? Because we can't just do the old playbook. And we also can't just turn them loose like we do for field scientists on Earth and say, good luck, have fun, come back in a few days with a bag of rocks. We need to actually be enabling this with a lot of careful support. Now, if you've been following this, you know that last year, Apollo 1, unmanned, went around the moon and came back. Not Apollo 1, Artemis 1. Apollo's sister. So Artemis 1 went around. We're coming up on Artemis II, which will be manned. It'll be a crewed trip. It will go up, it'll circle the moon, and come back. But Artemis III, this is where it gets juicy. It was originally scheduled for 2024. Delays associated with the pandemic, things like that. It looks like we're actually talking about perhaps a January 2026 actual launch. But we're going back. We're going to the South Pole. And actually, they have announced that the first woman to walk on the moon will be on Artemis III, as well as the first person of color. So that sort of absurd drawing is literally the mock-up for the lander. Now, if you're looking at that, you're like, I don't really know if it's absurd or not. I want you to see those two tiny little figures at the bottom of it. Those are the astronauts for scale. This system, much, much taller than what we think of when we think about the landers from the Apollo era. There's literally an external elevator to get back to the top where they can get back in. This will land. You can see some of their gear sort of scattered around. Artemis III, first one to land back on the moon, is going to have a couple of days to be able to actually go around. We're talking about possibly like 3 to 4 actual EVAs, or extravehicular activities. They will not have a rover. They will have a hand cart with 3 wheels. And they're not allowed to go more than 2 kilometers away from that lander. To be fair, you'll be able to see the lander from anywhere within 2 kilometers. It is quite tall. Along with that, too, they will actually not have tracking beacons in the current design on their suits. The idea being if they can always see the lander, they're not going that far. It's not like they're going to get lost. So from a safety perspective, no issue. From a science perspective, the geologists are losing our collective minds. This is very anxiety-producing because for us it matters exactly where each sample is collected. It's not just go grab me some rocks and bring them back. I need to know where you found them, where they were in relationship to each other, in relationship to the landforms. All of this stuff so I can actually build this 3D map of what's going on and then take it backwards in time as sort of that 4th dimension to understand what's going on here. So the astronauts will all be challenged that they're going to be using dead reckoning for their positions to be able to call out alphanumeric grid spaces that they are in. Think battleship in space. I'm at B-17. To be able to do this. Now, we're talking about some real challenges Talking about not knowing how to handle the communication from mission control to the astronauts, doing work that they haven't done before. Obviously, we don't have any of the Apollo astronauts heading back up. The Artemis astronauts are definitely a new cohort. And those that have been doing all of this space travel in between, working on ISS and other things, this is a very different set of skills and tasks. They are being trained specifically for this. We're building up that side. We're also having to build up things like, so how hard is it to dead reckon your location? And to be able to say, oh, this is where I am, I made the target. Especially when you're going to be working in some very hostile lighting conditions. Artemis III will land at the south pole of the moon. The exact location is not set. They right now have 13 different landing sites under consideration. They'll probably not know the final landing site until days before it goes up, because it's something that as the lighting conditions change, if we lose our first launch date, then that will literally change what the preferred landing spot is. And so it was basically when it goes up. So the team who's giving them guidance will have to mock up somewhere between, say, 5 and 7 entirely separate science plans and have the team fully trained depending on which one they actually get to at the time. So we clearly have our work cut out for us. We have stuff to do, and we don't wait to the moon to practice. We actually use analogs here on Earth to be able to test this out. So I had the privilege of participating this last year in what's called Jet 3, Joint Experimental Technical Team. It's basically putting together a whole team of people and doing the first high-fidelity simulations or dry runs for this. That included real astronauts, real mission control. They had us tucked off to one side in the science backroom team because we absolutely rejected the first room they gave us, because it turns out scientists have opinions. But we also weren't doing the thing where we're like, oh yeah, they're just outside. We literally sent the astronauts out to Arizona. They're in an area, some of you may have heard of it, SP Crater, in northern Arizona. And we were down in Houston at Johnson Space Center, and we were working nights. So, we had to report to console around 2 or 3 in the afternoon to be able to do planning, discussion, mapping out the day. And we wouldn't get back to our hotel until between 2 and 5 in the morning. Because if we're going to also practice the idea of that we're working in these low light conditions at the South Pole, where the sun is always on the horizon and most of it is dark, we need to be able to do that in the dark with floodlights, which adds a lot of challenges. So what this looked like was something sort of like this. This was their base in the field for Jet 3. And this one, they actually got to have all of the bright floodlights where they actually had the engineering kits, they could do the repairs, they could fix comms links, things like that. But then they would kit up our 2 astronauts and send them off into the darkness, basically just geared up with the flashlights that are on their sort of exosuits, to be able to go trundle off, and they would chase behind them with a spotlight that they would always try and keep in the same orientation, so it would be the equivalent of the sun. So if you turn and you accidentally look into it, suddenly you're temporarily blinded, and you're just going to have to wait for a while so you can actually get that back. Trying to sort of create this weird light condition. Now, just like Artemis, we needed to be science motivated. That's why they brought us in as a team of scientists, 10 of us selected from across the US to be this guidance team. And we spent the months leading up to the simulation putting together what were the science targets. Now, we're not going to use the exact same science targets as we would for the moon, because as much as we pretend it is not actually the moon. Turns out having an atmosphere gives us surface processes, we have water runoff, things like that, and so we went ahead and included those sorts of things in there. But we divided our questions up into 4 main categories. We cared about the volcanology, the surface processes, that's anything that would involve wind or water or dust moving around. We cared about age relationships, and we cared about tectonics. So surface processes is the one that's not going to really translate particularly to the moon, but the rest of them are there. And then we would also include, say, impact events on the moon, that we didn't have any impact events hanging out super conveniently for us in this volcanic field in Arizona. So for each one of these themes, we had anywhere from 3 to 5 science objectives. It's a lot of science objectives. It's a lot that we're trying to manage. We're divided up into groups, advocating for and representing those sorts of questions based around our own expertise and trying to create this tension within the group for when you actually have that argument. You can't do all of the things. How do you make the call? And so we did not have any hierarchy at all between these theme groups or the goals within the theme groups. What we did was be able to map it out into space to figure out, okay, this point in space is the most helpful for my theme, and we could prioritize there. Now, before they actually turned us loose, they needed to also give us some training too. So after we'd done our first round of development, creating initial maps, trying to look at what this was going to be like, they actually brought us all in to Johnson Space Center the first week of August. Turns out that is not the time of year to visit Houston. They didn't give us much free time, so it wasn't, I guess, as bad as it could have been. But it was very hot. This is actually me with one of my former graduate students who does work at NASA now. She's actually a full-time member of this project. I'm extraordinarily proud of her. But we were standing on the floor of the active mission control room while they are supporting International Space Station. And if you look behind us, you can see my entire team. Every last one of us is doing either a selfie or we're getting somebody else to take the picture, because it turns out we are not cool. You let us down on the floor, and we're like normally on the tour that you don't actually get to go down on the floor sort of thing, because it's real action going on. And we're all huddled by the side, and some of the people are actually on console are like, it's okay if you take pictures. It's okay, it's okay. And next thing you know, we're whispering because we're not trying to make any noise because they're on the console headsets, but we are absolutely losing our minds, taking photos with each other like, oh my gosh. Yeah. I tell people someday I'm going to get used to this enough that I'm not fangirling out. Today is not that day. Next year doesn't look good either. It's just such a privilege. So we got to actually go into the active mission control. We got training in the actual training rooms on the headsets. Honestly, those are awful. If you've had the privilege of getting to visit Johnson Space Center, I really suggest that you do. They've got a fantastic tour, but they've completely refurbished and recreated the Apollo 11 mission control room to the point that they remade a mug that one of the controller's children had painted for him in school. And then they recreated that. They've got the ashtrays. They've got all the fake cigarettes in them. They had to get all of the wallpaper redone back from the original patterns. And the most horrifying thing was when we looked out over this and we realized the headsets had not changed. Because it also turns out that as much as NASA is the cutting edge, they are so superstitious. Because at the end of the day, you are literally making a giant wad of metal fly through the air to go land on the moon, and even they know that's magic. You've got to be a little suspicious. It doesn't matter how good your engineering is. There's clearly some sort of magic involved. And, if that means we don't change our underwear, we don't change our underwear. So the headsets have basically stayed the same. Our flight controller, even when we were just going to be doing for Sims, he's an actual flight controller. He's going to be the lead flight controller for the Artemis missions. He let us know during training we are not allowed to wear red. No red. Which included the NASA logo. Has that red swoop through it? Verboten. If we wanted to pick the stitching out, we were allowed to wear that shirt. He literally lined us up and told us if our shirt was too red. One of the women was told it was okay, it was coral enough. But there's these superstitions and traditions that all sort of come in, and we have to find ways we're honoring them. We're getting the training in the things like that are sort of goofy, but we're also getting training in things like the actual virtual reality. This is my grad student, Angela, again. She is literally in the virtual reality system. You can see the screen behind her that's sort of giving the view that she is. She is on the moon as an astronaut trying to figure out how to use the tools to be able to pick up rocks, because you can't just bend over. They're also doing things, you can literally throw the digital rocks. So we, not going to lie, our geologists, we took turns throwing digital rocks as far as we possibly could, which is very, very far on the moon. It was very satisfying to launch these things because you spent so much time trying to figure out how to use your digital grabbers to be able to pick it up in the first place. But we did that. We got to practice driving with their simulators for when they actually have the lunar rovers back up there. They made us wear the gloves. So this is actually in a vacuum container right there, and you can see me failing at a Rubik's Cube. The gloves are custom made for the astronauts to achieve fit. And while I'd always heard like the gloves are so hard, because this is essentially you're in a very stiff balloon, right? You got your oxygen in there with you. The real challenge is all of the other joints are not where you expect them to be because of where they're allowed to have these stress points. And so it's actually really common for astronauts to get bruised, to pull things. So prior to going up for spaceflight, there's actually a window of time before they go up that they're not allowed to train in the spacesuits in the neutral buoyancy lab, which is underwater and can simulate some of that, because there's too much risk they could get hurt by their suit. And so they need to be able to have this gap so that way they don't pull something the day before they're supposed to go up or the week before they're supposed to go up that would compromise their ability to succeed. So we're actually figuring out, okay, what's the limited mobility? How hard is it to pick these things up? They actually brought in the prototypes of the tools that they're using and invited us to cackle maniacally about what we thought were some great and terrible designs. So we really could actually do this with the real tools and know what was going on as we're asking these astronauts to go out and do stuff. So for our plan, we were given 4 EVAs with 1 day off in the middle. And so an EVA is an extravehicular activity. That's anything where you're in the spacesuit. We had 2 short ones, a day off, and 2 long ones. And with these 4 EVAs, we're supposed to be answering all of those approximately 20 science objectives, or as many of them as we can possibly manage, which is hard. Turns out you also walk very slowly in a modified spacesuit. We can't use the real spacesuits because they're a couple 100 pounds, but we're using these sort of modified ones to be able to sort of mimic that, but that still doesn't finish accounting for the difference in gravity, or we are on Earth, a sagebrush. They're trying to take this little 3-wheeled cart through the sage. The astronauts have to stay as a pair when you're setting this up. They can be no more than about 50 meters away from each other for safety reasons. Every gram matters, whether it's up or down. So up is the tools you bring. You got to make a decision. Do I need 2 hammers? Is 1 hammer good enough? Do I need 2 scoops? Can they share? How much time do I lose by making them share? All of this has to be factored in when we're figuring that out, because we literally only have 100 kilograms for up and 100 kilograms for down. That includes all the packing materials. Given the packing materials, it's pretty realistic that what we're actually going to bring back from Artemis III might only be about 33 kilograms worth of rock, because we have to have all of the secure material that's actually holding it. We're only allowed to talk to the astronauts once a day. There was a brief phone call, but otherwise we just got 1 really long email describing what it is that they're going to do, any updates to the plan, what we want them to focus on. And we got to cover as much as we can. So our plan ended up looking something like this, where that white circle is the outer bounds of where we are allowed to be able to go to. And each of those 4 color loops, sort of like petals in a flower, is one of our EVA plans. And our first one, not showing up super great, but was blue. That's the one that goes off to the west there, towards the most obvious volcano. That's SP crater there. Followed by yellow, which it goes to the south. Green, that's not showing up well at all, to the north. And finally, purple off to the east. And the different dots you see on there, like M23, M18, these are positions that we had put together as serving multiple different objectives. Different people from different themes had all said, "Ooh, I really want that one. Get me that one." They're color-coded based off of priority. So the green dots are the highest priority. These are the ones that are going to make the most difference for the most people, most themes. Let's get these. And so we try to get those early on. So we've got a couple of them on day 1, got 1 on day 2. We tried to actually sort of map this out. Well, it turns out life doesn't go as planned. So we had not seen the actual mock-up suits when we made this plan, and we didn't have a good reality check as to whether the speed we'd been told they could walk, which therefore the total distance they could cover, was realistic. And part of that's because they were still figuring this out themselves. This wasn't, NASA giggling in a corner about let's torture these scientists. It turns out it's not easy to hike in this. Yeah, and the idea for a suit like this, it's called an Atlas suit, is that it's restricting their mobility in ways that are similar. There's a whole harness system inside trying to adjust the weight so it's not as bad for the weight as a real suit. But you have limited mobility. You can't just turn your head. You're essentially moving your whole torso. You can see like the sort of elbow break is down here. You can't move your shoulders real well. And you're not going to hike fast. Now, and these are our two actual astronauts. These are Zena and Drew. And they were also trying to push this three-wheeled hand cart through the dirt and the sagebrush in the dark, dressed like this, while calling out their coordinate positions. We owe them a lot of ice cream. So what this looked like in the dark was something like this. So even having that spotlight that's coming in from the side, it's weak light. It'll be a little bit better than that when we're talking about the actual moon, and it's going to be, of course, like more broad-based. In this case, you also had some moonlight coming down, so you got a broader view than you would necessarily see on the moon. But they're mostly working with the flashlights that are installed in their suits. This is a very, very limited view of light. You can imagine if I sent you out to the desert with a hand flashlight and told you to go make a map of the entire space, it would be absolutely reasonable to laugh at me and tell me to find better hobbies. But this is exactly what we're doing with our astronauts. So we've got them out there. They're going to be working in these conditions. That's why we need to practice. We need to figure out, okay, how much of it can we actually see? What do we need to scale back for our objectives? Because we're trying to answer big picture questions with very small visibility space. How is this going to scale? And you can see actually here, this is super dark. That little thing right there is their cart. It's not showing up well here at all. And this is the two of them clustered together, staring down at a spot on the ground because they're using all of their flashlights to be able to illuminate it. Just trying to be able to see what's going on. And this thing is barely showing up in the top here is actually sort of a big dome tent that was used to be able to be as a base if they needed to be able to fix things out there. Now, those of us that are in Houston aren't seeing this from this view. We're seeing what's coming back as live video feed off of cameras that are mounted on these suits. We have audio coming back from them, live time. And the next day, we get the photos that they took because they have cameras that are taking photos. And each photo, the camera is preset. One click of the button will give you 3 different photos at 3 different exposure settings because we don't know how the light's going to be right then. And we don't want the astronauts using those gloves trying to fiddle through light settings on their camera. But we don't get those live time. So that would be sometimes where we could get the most useful data, but we literally don't get it until the next day when we can actually do a download overnight. So we've got this team of people trying to be able to squeeze lemonade out of some of the lemons of working under these conditions in the science evaluation room as a back room of mission control. So we've got, again, there's 10 of us in there. We've got the science lead who's herding the cats. Science communicator is the only person that's allowed to speak on the loop that leaves our room. And they're listening. They're trying to hear everything that's coming in from the EVA office, from the groups that are monitoring for, like, how's the shuttle doing? Like, all of that stuff is on a continuous feed, and they're trying to, like, listen to that to know what's going on. They can feed information into the rest of the team and be able to send reports back out. We've got leads for each of our theme topics. We've got somebody whose entire job is to say, I think the astronaut is wrong about where they are. Because if you're calling out, you're walking around in the dark with a flashlight, and you're like, I'm pretty sure I'm at B17, and they're like, oh no. And that really happened. This person was a very busy bunny. And there's another person in another office whose also entire job was that, and the two of them were in communication with each other, literally watching through that video camera feed to see landmarks and features and use that to say, okay, I actually have enough air to breathe. I'm not worried about any of this. I can actually tell that's not where they think they are. They're actually here, and be able to give us corrected positions. We have somebody who's logging play-by-play, everything that's going on. We've got multiple note takers. We've got people that are in charge of monitoring the tactical approach and the samples that are coming in, and what were those samples they didn't take, as they're making their choices. There are more roles than we actually had people for. We had to actually borrow some people from a couple NASA centers to literally just help fill in the gaps to be able to do this and respond. And their first idea was to have us set up in something that would be sort of like a traditional mission control, if you've seen them, where it's like the rows of desks, and you've got a whole bunch of screens in front of you, and you're just on your cute little headset, and you do push to talk to whoever you're trying to talk to, and they tried so hard to train us to do this. And it was almost immediately a lost cause. Because as scientists, what the value of having us is it's not that one of us actually knows about volcanoes and somebody else knows about tactics and somebody else knows about this. It's that we're trying to merge all of this together, and we need to be having authentic conversations and open communication that's in response to this changing situation. So we literally told them we didn't like the room we were in, put us in a room where we could move the furniture. And certain members of NASA were absolutely brilliant about setting us up for all that, and there were a couple others that looked like they were actually just wanted to go out in the parking lot and cry. So we immediately started moving tables around, shoved big tables into the middle, rejected the software they'd made for us to be able to monitor things as the digital map. We just didn't like it. It didn't do what we wanted to quite yet. So we just went out to the store, printed out giant maps, put them on the table in the middle, called it the science scrum. People who were there might or might not even get a chair. But then again, you might or might not need one. You're pointing, and you're putting on notes, and you're arguing with each other. And then the trench was where we set up the people who needed to literally be logging stuff as fast as they could on their laptops. They had screens right in front of them, and we set up screens around every surface that we could around the outside wall. Every time they asked us what we wanted, we asked for more screens. They're like, we have brought you every single computer screen that was not locked down in this building. And we're like, yes. Can we have some large, flat screen TVs? We'd like some wall-mounted things, please. So part of this is literally what do you actually need to be able to do this? What do you need to be able to see? Do you keep asking somebody else to update you, or do you actually have the situational awareness of what's going on to be able to do stuff? And who needs to be close enough to talk? And who needs to be far enough away that they're not being bothered by the talk? You can see that position tracking person is sort of off in the corner in timeout. They did not get to sit with everybody else. They needed to essentially not listen to anyone else. They needed to only listen to the astronauts and be watching that video. So that giant screen in front of them is one of those wall screens with those videos feeds coming through. And they could just head down, ignore everybody else, and just do their job. Whereas people in the scrum needed to be all about communication with each other, as well as sort of that greater awareness. So what that actually looked like is us wedged into a training classroom, taking over every last table that we can. That's not pictured in my layout there is that we also got famous for having the best snack table anywhere. We developed the slogan, science is fueled by snacks. People would sneak up from other parts of Mission Control to be able to eat our snacks. We found the good bakeries. If you're going to be in there overnight, you got to get the good stuff. So in this particular day, I'm sitting in the trench space right here, and you can see the edge of the science scrum, and off over here, sort of the spot where they've got the person who's working on position tracking. And the science scrum itself is gathered around, so we've got these big printed maps. And first rule of if you're doing something that's evolving, you don't use pen. Second rule is you don't use pencil either. But how we keep track of this? We stole every last Post-it note we could find in the entire building. And then we trimmed them into thin little strips using scissors that we also stole. There was a lot of piracy involved. We returned everything. Most of it probably made it back to the right spot. But we needed to be able to track where they were and what was going on. Now, this is the spatial component. It really mattered what the time component was to be able to look back. So we had another large screen that's showing us a play-by-play. We have somebody's entire job is putting in on time locks every single thing that happens. And it's color-coded automatically based off of what sort of activity it is. Is it sampling? Are they describing? Are they walking? Are they lost? To be able to help us figure out what's happening, because we have an opportunity to be able to influence what happens next, but only if we know what's happened before. We need to keep really, really good spatial and temporal situational awareness to be able to do anything useful whatsoever. So this is a close-up on our map, because we are also, if nothing else, absolutely geeks. So one of our members actually had the tiny micro machines left over from his childhood of the astronauts, and so we used those as our sort of war games moving around to track the positions, so we always knew where they were. Nobody messed with the little mini astronauts. This was serious stuff. And by the time that anyone EVA was done, you can see post-it pandemonium going on here. There's sticky notes everywhere. They've been moved. The sticky started to lose because we moved it too much. They're taped down. These became absolute works of art with all of these notes and annotations where they could be shared and accessed. And people, again, would be racing up from other parts of Mission Control to see it because they realized that they didn't, well, they had cameras installed to watch us. You can see one in the sort of back corner there. They didn't have anything that could actually see the maps we were making. And that was something that they needed. So again, this is our planned map. This is, of course, what we're going to do. We spent months developing this. It is carefully crafted. It is all achievable. And this is what we did. So you can see that, you know, the green one and the purple one were not too bad. If you also look carefully, you'll see that we actually had to remove some of the spots that were on that original one because the green and purple, we actually had a chance when we had that off day, we were allowed to actually remove some of the stops. We could revise it because we knew they couldn't move as fast as we'd been told they could. But that blue one, that very first day that had our highest priority site of the entire mission, our astronauts got stuck on a hill and never found anything. They're wearing these suits. They're trying to get through the sage. It's an uphill. We'd been told it was within the scope of what they could do. They are losing their minds trying to drag this cart up there. They're going over rocks. There is a dirt road nearby. They've been told they're not allowed to use it. Again, we owe them a lot of ice cream. These are incredibly passionate, dedicated, hardworking folks. So they made it sort of out, did this loop. We never actually, the entire time, knew exactly where they were. The yellow trip down here, you can see we lost this leg of it. We captured it again on a purple day. But man, the number of times they told us that they'd gotten to position M8 down at the bottom there. We got there. We're like, oh, you're a quarter mile away. It just feels like you walked that far. Because it's dark, you're wearing this heavy suit, you're in very disorienting conditions. And it's a really, really hard thing to navigate. So we had to keep spending a lot of time trying to update these positions and figure out where are you really and what do you need to find. We had other spots, they found the location, but they weren't sure they'd found the location. So there's these challenges with that placement. Now the reality of what we actually got was we got probably less than half of our science objectives. Yeah, and part of that's because some of them were really big. Yeah, go for the fences. Don't start with something that's super small. We're going to try to do X, Y, Z. Go for it. Otherwise, you're not going to have a shot at being able to do there. But coming in at less than 50% was still a little disheartening. We also lost all of our highest priority targets because they were the ones that turns out were the least accessible. We also didn't have the opportunity, if this had been a real mission, if those things on the first day had been the highest priority targets, on a real mission, we would have had the opportunity to, on day 2, say, okay, we got some lessons learned. Can we fix that? Can we go back? For this one, they specifically needed us to stick to those 4 plans. So once EVA-1 was a failure, we could not actually go back and try and recapture EVA-1. We needed to move on to EVA Plan 2. And so that also created those issues there. We also learned a lot about the strategy about prioritization. Because what we had done is we'd prioritize individual field stations based off of, well, like, you know, volcanology says it's really important, surface processes says it's really important. All right, this is going to get a bulk score of 4. Cool. But within that, we hadn't actually prioritized which of the science objectives and science questions that were the most important. And when you're realizing you're going to have to lose so much of what you started out with because of this limited view, this sort of flashlight in the dark perspective, we need to be able to actually scale that back and tone that down. So we've really redeveloped, we've actually written recommendations on how to be able to do that differently, how to be able to do the prioritization in totally different ways. They're going to be much more effective, and we'll also be able to create cascading backup plans. And so that right now has already been integrated into proposals that have been put forth to NASA for the actual Artemis III geology team. So we're actually seeing these things implemented already. You know, for like, how do we actually scale this? How do we reprioritize? How do we adapt on the fly? And how do we improve that communication? Because the communication is essential. And while within the science team we had great communication with each other, sometimes the astronauts would ask us a question, and by the time it got to us, that was pretty fast, but then we would have to get an answer. And then we would have to send it up through 3 different levels of relay before it could get back to the astronaut. And sometimes when you're playing a game of telephone, even with extraordinarily well-trained people, these are not people who are extraordinarily well-trained in geology. They are extraordinarily well-trained to operate on the International Space Station. So they don't know the words that we're using. And so sometimes the message got back to the astronauts, we'd hear it get played out over the radio, and we're banging our heads off of the tables, like this doesn't even make sense. You know, if you want the red rock or the blue rock, and the answer is duck, that is not going to help anybody. And so there's discussions about how to be able to streamline that communication as it comes up, how to be able to do increased training across the entire board. You know, not just where we're learning about, you know, how to speak on the loops and, you know, how things work in mission control, but making sure that we're actually giving them sort of the training, getting the astronauts on board with the science development early in the process, so that way they're invested members of the science team. They care about it a lot. But if all they know is I'm supposed to go pick up a rock, man, they will kill themselves to find the best rock, but they don't really know what the best rock is. So they will work incredibly hard to do the best they can, but it might not be the result you were actually looking for. So we've actually been able to identify some of these communication vulnerabilities to be able to improve this and to be able to make it better. So based off of some of these lessons learned, Jet 5 is actually in operation right now. They're going through their planning stage. They'll actually launch with their fake astronauts this fall. The Artemis III geology backroom team selection process is already in full swing as well. Those proposals, you had to propose as a group of 10 people. I believe it's about 10 groups made it to the final round. Those were due in April. We expect actually having that announced sometime around maybe January, somewhere around there. And actually a bunch of us from Jet 3 looked at each other, like, nobody knows this better than we do. So you better believe most of us joined a team all as one group, using these lessons learned and crafting expectations of the future. But Artemis 3, we're looking at 2026, like January 2026, being able to return to the moon, first time since 1972, to put people back on the moon and usher in an entirely new era of space exploration. This one really driven by science, by having to forge these new partnerships and connections. It'll be an international team, so a global effort to be able to change the future of space, starting on the moon and extending from there. The roadmap is onwards to Mars. So this is a really, really exciting time. It is thrilling to get to be part of it. We've got projects going on all over the country to be able to support it. We actually just were awarded $750,000 to my team in Idaho, using our volcanoes as analogs for some similar efforts, specifically trying to fix the where am I problem. And we're going to see just some amazing things in the next couple of years. So I hope this is some interesting and helpful background and info, and I hope you think of it when you're watching the TV broadcast 2026. Artemis back on the moon.
Q&A is available.
Thank you, that was wonderful. A lot of the challenges that you face exploring outer space are similar to our scientists who are exploring inner space, the deep ocean.
Yes.
Is there collaboration between the two groups of scientists? I know the technologies that, like Robert Ballard is developing, are amazing. Are you guys collaborating at all?
So, I used to be the geology lead for the NASA subsea project, which was literally using Robert Ballard's stuff. And it was a partnership between NASA and NOAA, where we were using unmanned submersibles in the Pacific Ocean to be able to study a couple spots that were analogs for Enceladus, one of Saturn's icy moons. So there's been some work in that regard. It's also very much that same problem of, like, it's darkness. Here's a flashlight. Good luck. GPS doesn't happen. There's no such thing as GPS underwater. There's no such thing as GPS on the moon. So some of these challenges are definitely there. There's been some movement towards doing some of that, trying to be able to borrow some of that stuff back and forth. I think there's a lot more potential to be able to keep doing that. One of the things that we're lucky on the moon, we've got much better maps of the moon than we do of the seafloor. So we are very, very fortunate in that regard. It was a deeply humbling experience working with the deep sea community for a couple of years. It was terrifying. You're just like, here we go. Let's go try to find a thing. Hopefully the sea agrees with it. But yeah, there's a lot of very useful collaboration crossover there.
How big was the seatbelt rock?
Oh, seatbelt rock, I want to say it's somewhere around like yay big. We're talking like give or take a football. And it's got a whole bunch of like vesicles in it, those void air bubbles. It's a piece of basalt. It's got some olivine in it. For what it's worth, it looks identical to the rocks that are in Idaho where I live. So it's actually really convenient that I'm in an area that is one of the type locations for lunar volcanism because it's got the exact same types of rocks, and we can actually see a lot of similarities. But yeah, this didn't get too big and there's no way you're picking it up in a spacesuit. Get too small and again, there's no way you're picking it up in a spacesuit. But yeah, somewhere in that sort of space.
Yes. How did they determine they wanted to go to the South Pole? And does that mean that there's going to be a polar orbit before they land? Which is kind of unusual, right? Instead of equatorial.
Yeah, so the South Pole is of interest because we've got a lot of rocky material there. The moon sort of has some hemispheres. It's got dark patches and light patches when you look at it at night. Those actually correspond to different rocks. So they're specifically looking for some of those white patches, which are anorthosites. And the South Pole, part of the interest with being at the polar region in particular, is because that very low-angle sun means that you have permanently shadowed regions or areas that have literally never seen sunlight. If you've got something that's never seen sunlight, you're talking about basically getting yourself down to absolute zero for temperature, pretty close to it, which acts as a volatile trap. So we've got some evidence already from some polar orbiting stuff, because we do have some stuff that's already orbiting as a polar orbit up there, that indicates that we actually have water ice, methane ice, things like that, that are actually trapped in some of these permanently shadowed areas. So there'll actually be a robotic mission that's going to go up 2024. It's called Viper, that is going to go to the South Pole. Not the same landing site, but this will be robotic and be able to drive around. It's got a meter-long drill specifically looking for these volatiles. The motivation here is not that we need water to drink, but that having these particular volatiles up there on the moon could actually serve essentially as a waypoint of rocket fuel for continuing on to Mars.
Lacking GPS on the moon, I wonder if something could be invented that could sit on the top of Artemis for a 360-degree positioning method.
They had one of those during Apollo. That's why I get so twitchy. So during Apollo, it's basically an angle and distance. They can use that they can, it's not going to come out as coordinates, but it can be like they're this far away at this angle. They didn't have it for Apollo 11. It's actually fascinating. If you go to Johnson Space Center and you do the tour, you can actually see where they've recreated Apollo missions. They actually have the real audio because all of that is preserved. And you can see where they literally had a man with his hands under a projector screen, like sliding around little paper doll astronauts for their positions, which felt a little too close to our micro machines, not gonna lie, driving around on our map. But by the later stages of Apollo, they absolutely had this distance and range. It was not deemed a requirement for flight. Require is a very, very loaded word within the NASA community and space flight. It means absolutely must have to happen. And it turns out that's what you start with. And my guess, and this is me absolutely speculating here, is that because they were going to be there's no rover and it's going to be a fairly short distance, like a 2-kilometer maximum distance from the lander, it was deemed non-essential for the safety of the astronauts because they could just see where they were going. They weren't going to be able to get lost. And that science didn't realize there wasn't going to be that because it's literally removing a technology that used to be there. But this goes back to the issue of every single gram matters up and down. Honestly, I think science would probably, as a group, be willing to trade a few rocks to be able to get that positioning system back. But as of last I heard, that's not on the table, unfortunately, or at least for Artemis III.
Yeah, I had a question about tectonics. What type of questions are you asking about that? Because I'm not aware that there's any active tectonic activity on the moon.
Absolutely. So Earth is the only planetary body that we're aware of that has plate tectonics in the way that we consider with like plate motions and subduction zones and crumples and things like that. So what we can also, though, get are in more localized spaces, areas where we've got fractures due to, say, magma rising will actually come up from below and will actually be able to create tension cracks in top surfaces, things like that. There is some research that's going on right now for looking at some places on Mars for some possible, like they used the word tectonics at the big lunar planetary science conference this last year, and the room erupted. You can imagine. Because it's really marginal sort of evidence, but it's sort of some evolving things for what could actually better be thought of as just some faulting that's going at some odd angles. So there's a potential for faults, and we sometimes just will loop those under like a larger concept of tectonics. But yeah, no plate tectonics on the moon.
I have two questions, and a fascinating presentation, thank you. The first is, if I heard you correctly, your team will be allowed only one particular conversation for X number of minutes, not to exceed 20, when the astronauts are actually on the surface. Did I hear that correctly?
So what we were doing in JET was we were allowed to have one brief conversation before they would actually suit up, so when they were sort of in the lander is the concept, to basically be a briefing prior to that day's EVA. The actual style that they're going to have, it's probably, again, going to be a fairly brief conversation. The actual science team might have one representative who's actually in the room for it. It's probably mostly going to be centered on sort of safety and updates. But that's obviously not enough if you're trying to enable the astronauts to be true members of your science team, which means that one of our recommendations is that those astronauts need to be looped in not a few weeks beforehand. We got to do training sessions with them via a very, very long Zoom day, about a month before all of this happened, but instead actually have them part of the team embedded within it when they're still making the early decisions. Now, of course, you don't actually know 2 years in advance who's going to be selected for that astronaut crew. Somebody could also be sick, but you have like a pod of astronauts who are your people that are finalists. Have them involved from the beginning so that way you don't need to be burning that much time later.
Thank you. Okay. The second question is, it was fun to see your video when you were a youngster doing this, and some of us have what are called SEEs, significant emotional events, that really synthesize what we want to do in our life. And I'm wondering if that ever happened to you, and if you can recall something specific that spurred your interest in this.
You know, I was a rock geek from a child. If you can harass my parents, they will, I'm sure, have absolutely no qualms telling embarrassing stories about me in the lobby afterwards. But even as an infant, I would crawl around and I would put rocks in my mouth, and they'd have to squeeze my mouth like chipmunks. I'd be spewing rocks. I came back from kindergarten one day. I got off the school bus with just this terrible limp, and Mom was worried what had happened to me. And I explained that I had no pockets in my dress. And she's still like, yes, and? Well, when I was finding rocks in the playground, I had nowhere else to put them but my shoes. So I had filled my shoes with rocks to be able to still have my samples when I got home. Most geologists, honestly, this is not their backstory. Most geologists don't even know that it's a field until they get to college and they take a gen ed class and they're like, oh my gosh, I get paid to go hiking and camping and set things on fire and smash some stuff? Yes! You know, I can also do some high-end tech. We got drones, we got supercomputers. Like, I got this. That's where we get most geologists from. I'm one of the small group that basically was very geeky as a child, and nobody ever told me it was a bad idea. And to actually help stabilize it, I got a free ticket to the Tulip City Gem and Mineral Show when I was in kindergarten. And I convinced my parents to go. I think it was like a rainy Saturday. They're like, all right, well, she kind of likes rocks. Like, we can do this. Next thing they knew, we had joined as a family. Dad took me to meetings. He was the second youngest member there. I had just inherited an entire club of bonus grandparents who rigged every single raffle. So I won a door prize every meeting, darn it. If they weren't feeling creative about pocketing a ticket to make sure they pulled the right one, I was the only person who had the blue ticket. That sort of community support. So it wasn't so much a particular event, so much as really stumbling into a wonderful community of people that didn't laugh when you've got a 5-year-old who's geeking out about rocks, that is getting poundage limits on what they can collect on the family vacation. That just were like, okay, yeah, that seems rational. You're 5 and you've got your career plotted out. It sounds like a good time. And I didn't actually get into the space stuff until I actually got to Idaho. And the person who I replaced, he's emeritus now. His name is Scott Hughes. He is an absolutely generous, lovely, wonderful person. And he'd been doing some stuff with space, and so he just introduced me to some of his friends. And next thing you know, we're writing proposals and doing all sorts of new projects and reinvigorating Idaho as a place for space exploration. So never underestimate the value of individual or groups of mentors. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you. Class is dismissed. See you next month. See you next Tuesday. Have a wonderful week.